In 1900, 31 years before the Nazi regime came to power, Germany became the first nation in the world to legally require informed consent for medical experimentation on human beings. This is the story of how the world's most advanced medical ethics laws became completely irrelevant. Welcome back to the lab, my curious test subjects. Today we are talking about one of history's darkest ironies. Before World War II, Germany didn't just have medical research ethics guidelines. They had the most progressive, detailed, legally binding protections for human research subjects on the planet: informed consent, documentation requirements, special protections for children and vulnerable populations. The whole system. And then, a few decades later, Nazi physicians would conduct some of the most horrific human experiments in history and claim in their defense that no ethics codes existed to guide them. They were lying. Let me show you exactly how. So, how did Germany end up with the world's most progressive medical ethics laws in the first place? It started with a scandal. In the late 1800s, a German physician named Albert Neisser decided to inoculate patients with syphilis without asking them first. In medical ethics terms, that means he intentionally infected people with a deadly sexually transmitted disease and didn't tell them. When this became public, the reaction was swift and furious. The case was discussed in the Prussian parliament. A panel of leading German clinicians, including the famous pathologist Rudolf Virchow, reviewed what Neisser had done. Lawyers weighed in. Everyone agreed this was unacceptable. So in 1900, the Minister for Religious, Educational and Medical Affairs issued a directive to every hospital and clinic in Germany. It became known as the Berlin Code. The rules were clear. Medical interventions that were not for diagnosis or treatment were forbidden if the subject was a minor, not competent, or had not given clear consent after having the risks explained to them. Think of it like a terms and conditions agreement. Except, people actually had to read it, understand it, and sign it before doctors could use them as test subjects. All of this had to be carefully documented. Research could only be performed by the medical director of each facility, or with their explicit authorization. The directive was not legally binding, but it was the first time a modern government issued regulations on medical experimentation. It applied to most of the northern German Reich and most of the German population. 3 decades later, in 1930, 72 children died in Lübeck after receiving a contaminated tuberculosis vaccine. Public outrage erupted again. So, in 1931, the Reich Minister of the Interior issued new guidelines titled Guidelines for New Therapy and Human Experimentation. This time, the regulations were binding law. Spoiler, they would later ignore every single word of this. Patients had to make their own informed decisions. Written reports were required for every clinical trial. Experiments on dying persons were forbidden. Germany now had the most advanced medical research ethics protections in the world. So when Nazi physicians stood trial after the war and claimed there were no ethics codes to guide them, what were they actually saying? They were lying. Germany had 2 published codes of medical research ethics: the 1900 directive, the 1931 binding law. Both required informed consent, both protected vulnerable subjects, both mandated documentation and oversight. The Nazi physicians knew this, and yes, they knew exactly what those laws said. Their defense was that there were no international ethics codes. That argument was technically true, but morally irrelevant. They didn't need an international code. They already had domestic law that explicitly forbid everything they did. It's like claiming you didn't know murder was illegal while standing in a courtroom built specifically to prosecute murder. The real reason the Nazi physicians ignored Germany's ethics laws had nothing to do with the existence or absence of international guidelines. In medical ethics terms, that means the law was irrelevant the moment they decided their subjects weren't people. The most sophisticated ethical regulations in the world are meaningless when the society that created them decides that certain human beings are no longer worthy of ethical consideration. The law said you needed informed consent, but if you've labeled your subjects as subhuman, then in your mind, consent doesn't apply. The law said you couldn't experiment on people who couldn't understand or agree. But if you've decided they don't count as people, the law doesn't matter. Protection for vulnerable populations, not if those populations have been declared enemies of the state. Every single safeguard Germany built into its ethics codes had the same unspoken assumption, that the people being experimented on were people. When that assumption was abandoned, the entire ethical framework collapsed. The Nazi physicians had many excuses: no international codes, wartime necessity, scientific progress. But the truth is simpler and darker. In medical ethics terms, that means having the rulebook doesn't matter if you've decided the rules don't apply to certain human beings. Germany wrote the best rules in the world, then proved that rules are only as strong as the society willing to enforce them. Germany wrote the rulebook on medical research ethics, then proved that the most sophisticated regulations in the world mean absolutely nothing when a society decides that certain human beings are no longer worthy of ethical consideration. Ethics by checkbox, genocide by choice. The Berlin Code and the 1931 guidelines were real. They were detailed. They were legally binding. And they were completely ignored because the physicians who violated them had decided their victims were not covered by the protections designed for human beings. The Nuremberg trials would later create the Nuremberg Code, a new set of international ethics guidelines, because the world finally realized that national laws were not enough. But the lesson remains: you can write all the ethics codes you want. If the people in power decide certain lives don't matter, the codes are just paper. If this story made you question what we consider ethical today, hit subscribe. There's plenty more where this came from. My curious test subjects.